The wooden doors of the church were heavy carved with angels and vines that seemed to whisper of sacred vows. Behind them, laughter carried laughter that did not belong on a wedding day. Amina froze the satin of her gown brushing against the polished oak as she leaned closer. At first, she thought she had misheard. But then the words sliced through the air, cold and deliberate. "Man, I'm telling you." Stephen's voice, the groom she was about to marry, rang out sharp and smug. "This is all part of the plan. My boss loves this diversity charity stuff. Me standing up there with her perfect optics. Promotion guaranteed." A heavy silence fell between the men, and then came the sound of his best man's chuckle, ugly and raw. "Guess you're braver than me. I couldn't stomach being tied to them for life." Stephen laughed, too light, casual, cruel. "It's not life. It's survival. She thinks it's love, but once we sign those papers, I'll keep her in line. Her people will be happy with scraps and she'll learn fast who's in control." Amina's blood turned to ice. She pressed her hand to her lips to keep from crying out. The veil slipped forward, the sheer fabric grazing the wood, as though trying to cover her ears. But the words kept coming louder, uglier. "You've seen her family," Stephen sneered. "Her father struggling to speak properly. Her mother with that scarf looking like she doesn't belong. They'll embarrass me in front of the board if I don't keep them in check. I'll give them a budget-tight leash, no shame. They'll be too grateful to complain." His friend barked laughter. "Better you than me, brother. I wouldn't trust them around my kids. But hey, you get to look like a hero." The floor tilted beneath her feet. The flowers in her bouquet blurred through her tears. She had stood in this dress only minutes ago, believing she was about to step into forever. Now every stitch of satin felt like a costume, every pearl pin in her hair a mocking decoration for a play she had never agreed to perform in. She had imagined this day since she was a girl, her mother showing her movies where love was a promise, not a transaction. Her father saying, "One day you'll meet someone who sees you for who you are." For 2 years she thought she had. Every late-night conversation, every kiss goodnight, every whispered, "I love you," all of it was crumbling in real time, smashed by the weight of Stephen's truth. Her chest heaved, each breath shallow, the sound of his words echoing louder than the organ outside, tuning for the ceremony. Guests sat waiting, hundreds of eyes expecting a radiant bride to glide down the aisle. And here she stood, in the half-light of a hallway, learning she was nothing more than a pawn in a man's career. Her heart screamed to burst through the door, to throw the bouquet at his smug grin, to shout every word she had just heard. But her body locked. The betrayal rooted her where she stood trembling, pinned between the life she thought she was stepping into and the hell she was staring at now. Stephen's voice dropped to a casual murmur, cruel in its indifference. "It's just a small sacrifice. She gets the wedding she always wanted, and I get the future I deserve. Everyone wins. Everyone but her." Amina's eyes shut tight, tears burning hot. She wanted to vanish, to unhear, to rewind. But the laughter, the arrogance, the disdain, they had already carved themselves into her bones. This wasn't nerves. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was truth, raw and unveiled. Slowly, carefully, she pulled away from the door. Her body moved on instinct, her hand clutching the wall for balance. The bouquet trembled in her grasp until she let it fall, roses scattering like fragments of a dream shattered on the marble floor. Step by step she turned down the corridor, the long train of her gown dragging like chains behind her. She passed the open windows where sunlight spilled golden and cruel in its brightness. Each echo of her footsteps was a drumbeat counting down the seconds before her world exploded. At the end of the hall she stopped. Her chest rose and fell, her breath ragged. She yanked at the veil, ripping pins from her hair. The fabric floated to the ground, a discarded symbol of innocence. She was no longer the bride about to say yes. She was a woman on the edge of war. And in that moment she knew one thing with terrifying clarity: this wedding would not go the way anyone expected. Not him, not his boss, not the family waiting outside. No one. The air outside the church felt thick, almost too heavy to breathe, when Amina slipped into the side street and left her bouquet and veil behind. But inside, the ceremony had not stopped moving. Ushers shuffled guests from one pew to another. The organist tapped at the keys with restless fingers. Whispers grew like waves against the marble walls. No one knew where the bride had gone. Only one person carried her secret: Tasha. She had hugged Amina in the calf, felt the tremor in her cousin's shoulders, seen the streak of ruined mascara on her face. Tasha had sworn in that moment, not with words but with the tightening of her arms, that Amina would not face this storm alone. Now back at the church, she adjusted the bodice of her lavender bridesmaid dress. It was creased from sitting too long in the back booth of the cafe, but she did not care. What mattered was what she carried hidden in the clutch pressed against her side, her phone screen black recorder silently running in the background. The hallway near the sacristy was quieter than the grand nave where restless guests waited. The hum of the air vents mixed with the faint rustle of vestments from the altar. Tasha spotted him, Stephen Hale, standing with his tie loosened, pacing, as though the walls were closing in. For a moment she almost saw what Amina must have seen when she fell in love with him, the tall frame, the practiced smile, the surface-level charm. But under the harsh fluorescent lights all that polish dulled. His mouth pinched at the corners. His shoulders jerked in restless agitation. This was not a groom waiting for his beloved bride. This was a man calculating how to manage an image crumbling by the second. Tasha drew a deep breath and walked toward him, heels clicking softly on the polished stone. He noticed her immediately. "Tasha," he said, forcing a smile. "You've seen Amina." She disappeared. "Everyone's getting nervous." She tilted her head, letting her voice tremble just enough to sell the part. I talked to her for a moment. She's nervous, Stephen. She's scared. She thinks your mom doesn't approve. She worries maybe somebody said something careless." The words hung between them like bait. Stephen's eyes narrowed, his mask slipping for just a second. He looked away, running a hand across his jaw. "Careless. Look, she knows better than to embarrass her people like this. She's dramatic, always has been." Tasha felt her stomach twist at the contempt laced in his tone. It wasn't rage. It was worse. It was dismissal. A conviction so deep that he didn't even realize it exposed him. She kept her expression sympathetic, leaning closer as though she wanted to ease his burden. "She loves you, Stephen. She's terrified of messing this up. Maybe she just needs to hear from you that nothing was meant, nothing that could hurt her." Stephen huffed, impatient, like a man forced to repeat a point he thought obvious. "This is what she does, turns shadows into storms. I told her before, once the papers are signed, things will settle. I'll set the boundaries, make sure she understands how this is going to work. She'll be fine." There it was. Not the vile words Amina had overheard behind the ornate door, but close enough, the tone of superiority, the implication that love was less important than control. The way he spoke about boundaries was not the language of partnership. It was the language of possession. Tasha swallowed the heat rising in her throat and forced herself to nod to keep him talking. Every syllable, every sneer was being captured quietly by the microphone hidden inside her purse. The waveform pulsed on her phone screen, unseen by him, every vibration like a net tightening around his arrogance. She asked softly, "So, you don't think it's nerves? You think she's overreacting?" Stephen smirked faintly, the kind of smirk that carried centuries of dismissal in a single curl of the lip. "Always has been. She'll come back in. She doesn't have the guts to leave, not really. Not with her whole family watching." The contempt in his voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Tasha clenched her hands together to keep from slapping it off his face. But she remembered Amina's trembling words in the cafe. "We need him to reveal how he really feels. Don't blow up yet. Play it smart." She leaned back, let her voice soften. "I'll try to calm her. Maybe give her a little more time. I know she wants this to be perfect." Stephen shrugged, dismissive. "Tell her to stop being so dramatic. Once we're married, I'll handle it. Everyone just needs to relax." It was enough. Not the smoking gun, not the exact words that had gutted Amina, but enough to prove he viewed her as something to be managed, not cherished. Enough to show his arrogance. Tasha nodded politely and slipped away, heart-pounding phone still humming with the quiet capture of his disdain. In the hallway, she ducked into an alcove and pulled out her phone. The screen lit her face in the dim light. She stopped the recording, hit save, and played back the clip with her earbuds pressed tightly in her ears. There it was. She knows better than to embarrass her people. And then, once the papers are signed, I'll set the boundaries. The words dripped with condescension. Tasha closed her eyes, whispered under her breath, "Got you." Then she typed a quick message to Amina, got tone. "Need motive." The reply came back almost instantly. Thank you. Hold steady. Don't let him know yet. Tasha exhaled. Her cousin was shaken but still thinking clearly, still planning. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. And she was not going to fail her. Meanwhile, just across the nave, another confrontation was brewing. Diane Stevens' mother stood near the reception coordinator, lips pursed, eyes sharp. Her hand gestured toward the program, stabbing at the page where the Yoruba drum performance was listed. I told you already, Diane whispered harshly, though harsh enough that several bystanders heard tone down the cultural bit. This isn't some street festival. Keep it elegant. We want a wedding, not a show. The planner, Miss Marisol, stiffened, her jaw tightening as she clutched the clipboard. Mrs. Hale, the bride specifically requested that performance. It's part of her heritage. Diane's face hardened. It's too much. We need to keep this classy. Tasha, still nearby, caught every word. Her pulse spiked with fury. She wanted to step in to confront Diane right there, but she bit it back. Not yet. She had proof from Stephen already. Now she had his mother's prejudice as a second thread. Each comment was a brick in the wall of contempt surrounding Amina, and each brick would soon be revealed. She texted Amina again, fingers trembling with restrained anger. His mom just told the planner to cut the cultural performance. Not classy. Her words. This is bigger than him. It's his whole family. Amina's reply came slower this time. Stay calm. We'll use it. Don't let them see you're onto them. The organist struck a chord in the distance, sharp and dissonant, signaling impatience from the restless crowd. The ceremony had been delayed far too long. Guests shuffled, fanned themselves with folded programs, murmured theories. Maybe the bride was sick, maybe she'd fainted, maybe she was still getting dressed. No one suspected the truth, that behind the polished fade the groom and his family had already exposed themselves, not with rage but with the quiet, practiced cruelty of people who believed their disdain would never be heard. But it had been heard, recorded, preserved, waiting for the right moment. Tasha slipped back into the bridesmaid's dressing room, shutting the door behind her. She pressed her back against the wood and let out a shaky breath, finally allowing the anger to flicker across her face. She held up her phone, stared at the saved audio file. The proof was there, thin but sharp like a knife hidden in silk. She whispered to herself, "This is enough to start. We'll get the rest." And then she sat down at the vanity table, opened her messages, and began to plan with Amina in hushed words and clipped sentences. The first net had been cast. The groom had revealed his tone, his disdain. It wasn't the whole picture yet, but it was enough to prove he saw love as leverage and marriage as control. The audience of this story might not have been in that hallway, but they would feel the same sharp outrage that beneath the tuxedo and smiles a man was already practicing how to shrink the woman he was supposed to cherish. And the story had only just begun. The bridesmaid's dressing room smelled faintly of perfume and old wood polish. Tasha sat with her phone pressed tight in her palm, the recording saved the evidence, thin but sharp. She had promised Amina they would get more. The words she captured, Stephen dismissing her cousin as dramatic, promising to set boundaries, were enough to show contempt but not enough to break the faud in front of 100 witnesses. She lifted her head. Around her, bridesmaids whispered nervously, fixing curls, adjusting lipstick that was beginning to crack from too many anxious sips of water. They didn't know where Amina had gone, but they knew something wasn't right. The air was taut like a violin string wound too tight, threatening to snap. Tasha typed another message, got tone. But we need motive. We need the receipts. Across town in the little cafe, where she hid, Amina sat with her phone glowing in the dim light. The reflection of the screen carved her face into halves, one side soft with grief, the other sharpened by resolve. She was scrolling through her notifications when a direct message slid across the top of the screen. The sender's name wasn't one she recognized, Percussion Works vendor. She frowned, thumb hovering. The message opened. "Hey, just wanted to check. Was the change yesterday official? We got an email from Rep Groom Team telling us to cut your aunt's Yoruba drum interlude. Said it wasn't the right vibe, wanted something classier. We thought it was odd since you seemed excited about the performance. Just making sure." Amina's chest clenched. The message included an attachment, a screenshot of the email header. Her eyes flicked over the details, the sender line, the timestamp, the metadata at the bottom. It came from Stephen's assistant. The CC field was worse, Stephen's name bold and undeniable. Her throat burned. The Yoruba drum piece had been her one insistence, her way of honoring her mother's family and giving her aunt a moment of pride. She remembered her aunt's hands, worn strong, calloused from years of work beating rhythms on a drum she had carried from Nigeria to America decades earlier. That rhythm was supposed to fill the church tonight, tying generations together. And Stephen had erased it. Not by mistake. By design. She screenshotted the message, her fingers trembling. She forwarded it to Tasha. A moment later, another notification flashed. This time from an account with no profile picture, no recognizable name. Just J. The message read, "You don't know me, but I work in Stephen's department. I can't stand by. He's been bragging at work. Said the marriage is great optics for the Q3 philanthropy deck." People laughed. I didn't. "I'm sending you this because you deserve to know." Attached was a blurry capture of a Slack chat. The words weren't crystal clear, but they were legible enough. Stephen's handle. The phrase highlighted in faint gray, "Great optics for the Q3 philanthropy deck." Exactly what Mason likes to see. Amina's stomach flipped. She pressed a hand to her forehead, nearly dropping the phone. Her mind screamed at her. This was it. This was the motive. Not just disdain. Not just superiority. This was evidence that he had strategized her as a career move. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe it was fake, maybe it was doctored. But the vendor message was too precise, too verifiable. She didn't even know Jay. Why would a stranger risk their job to warn her? The pieces were falling into place too quickly, too painfully. She dialed Tasha. The call picked up almost instantly. "Tash," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He erased the drums. My aunt's performance. I just got the screenshot. His assistant sent the email. He was CC'd. Tasha hissed a curse under her breath. "Send it all to me. Right now." "There's more," Amina said. "Somebody from his job. They sent me a Slack capture. He said I was great optics for Q3. Silence on the line. Then Tasha's voice, low and steady. "That's motive. We've got contempt. Now we've got motive. This is the trail." They agreed to meet in the planner's office, neutral ground inside the church but away from prying eyes. When they slipped into the small office lined with binders and floral samples, Miss Marisol looked up from her clipboard, startled. "Where have you two been? The ceremony's falling apart. Guests are restless." "Marisol," Tasha said, firmly shutting the door. "We need you to look at something." Amina slid her phone across the desk. The planner adjusted her glasses and leaned close. Her brow furrowed as she scrolled. Then she gasped softly. "I saw this email," she murmured. "It came through yesterday. I thought it was unusual. I filed it just in case. But I assumed you had approved." "No," Amina said sharply, her voice trembling. "I didn't. I would never. That drum performance was my family's heart." Marisol's eyes hardened. "Then this wasn't you. It was them." She clicked through her files, pulling up the email in her system. There it was, the official record. Stephen's assistant, CC Stephen. The instructions plain as day: cut Yoruba drum interlude. Replace with contemporary playlist. Must keep elegant. Her hands shook as she turned the screen toward them. "It's real. And I have it on file." The room fell silent except for the hum of the overhead light. The truth was no longer whispers in a hallway. It wasn't just Stephen's tone of dismissal. It wasn't only Diane's disdain. Now it was proof, tangible, time-stamped. The kind of proof that could tear through the lies of charm and polish he wore like armor. Tasha broke the silence. "So what do we do? Do we confront him now? In front of everyone?" Amina's breath caught. Her heart yearned to scream the evidence into the nave, to shatter the illusion before the vows could even be spoken. But she thought of her mother sitting quietly in the pew with her headscarf already bearing the weight of Diane's silent judgment. She thought of her father, quiet and dignified, waiting to walk her down the aisle. She imagined their faces if she burst in raging. The shame they might feel, the whispers they would endure. "I can't humiliate my parents like that," she whispered. "Not without control, not without order." "Then we wait?" Tasha asked. "We wait," Amina said, "but not in silence. Not in shadows. If he used me as optics, then we'll turn the lights on him. Everyone will see." Marisol leaned back in her chair, her expression heavy with sympathy but also admiration. That takes courage. More than most people have. Amina straightened her shoulders, wiping the last traces of mascara streaks from her cheeks. No more shadows, she said. Her voice was low, but it carried a sharp edge like steel unsheathed. If he wanted a performance, he's about to get one. The words still echoed in the cramped office as Amina straightened her back and declared there would be no more shadows. Her tone had shifted, no longer the tremble of a bride betrayed, but the quiet command of a woman who had found her center. Tasha studied her cousin's face and knew instantly the plan was no longer about survival. It was about revelation. Outside, the muffled sound of the organ faltered into silence again, followed by the shuffle of pews and low murmurs of restless guests. The ceremony was long overdue. Somewhere in the nave, Stephen was probably rehearsing excuses, smoothing his hair, tightening the knot of his tie, trying to keep the illusion intact. But illusions had a short half-life when truth began to seep in. Across the street, banners fluttered in the late afternoon breeze. A hotel ballroom was hosting the Harborfront Philanthropy Luncheon, one of the most visible charity events in the city. Suits and dresses streamed past the valet station. A jazz trio played beneath strings of white lights. Inside that ballroom, the keynote speaker stood poised to address the city's elite, Marcus Mason, CEO of Hale and Harrington, the very man whose approval Stephen craved. The irony was exquisite. Fate or something like it had aligned the stage. The groom who bragged about optics was about to be trapped in them. Miss Marisol adjusted her glasses, catching sight of the banners through her office window. "That's the Mason luncheon," she murmured almost to herself. Then, as though realizing the gravity of the thought, she looked at Amina. "Marcus Mason is speaking right now." Across the street. Amina's pulse jumped. The name was familiar. Stephen had dropped it like an incantation dozens of times, praising Mason's leadership, idolizing his philanthropy portfolio. He was the reason Stephen orchestrated this fade of a marriage. Mason's admiration meant power, money, ascension, and now Mason was less than 50 yards away. Tasha's eyes narrowed. If Mason hears what Stephen has done, he won't just lose this wedding. He'll lose everything he was scheming for. Marisol hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I know the floor manager at the hotel. We've worked events together. If I call, maybe, just maybe, he can pass a message. Something discreet. Something that tells Mason this isn't gossip but a matter of values." Amina's breath caught. The thought of dragging Mason into her personal pain felt surreal. But she reminded herself this wasn't just personal anymore. Stephen had made it corporate, strategic. He had turned her life into a bullet point for quarterly metrics. Perhaps justice demanded that the very man he wanted to impress be present when the truth came to light. Marisol stepped into the corner, dialing quickly, her Spanish slipping softly into the receiver as she spoke with the hotel manager. A few nods, a low thank you. When she hung up, her face was grave but resolute. "The message is passed. No promises. But I said the words, matter of values." That was enough to get his attention. Silence thickened in the office. Outside, the hum of the crowd in the nave rolled on, oblivious to the machinery of truth grinding just beneath the surface. Amina exhaled slowly. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to her father's number. Her thumb hovered for a heartbeat, then she pressed call. He answered on the second ring, his voice deep and steady. "Daughter." Her throat tightened at the sound, but she forced her voice to hold. "Dad, when I speak, I need you to stand behind me. Not in front. Don't speak for me. Just be there." There was a pause, then the rumble of his assurance. "I'll be a wall you can lean on. Nothing more, nothing less." Tears prickled, but she blinked them back. That was all she needed, his quiet strength, the unshakable presence of a father who had never once treated her as a bargaining chip. She sent another message, this time to Pastor James, the officiant. She typed slowly, choosing each word. "Please stay present when I speak. I want order, not chaos." His reply came within moments, understood. "I will keep the house in peace." For the first time since the betrayal had ripped her heart apart, Amina felt the ground solid beneath her. She wasn't rushing blind into confrontation. She was choreographing it step by step, ally by ally. Meanwhile, Tasha moved with the restless energy of someone both furious and fiercely protective. She paced the room, tapping her phone. "We need contingencies," she muttered. "If this blows up, we can't risk you getting mobbed or cornered." She pulled up her rideshare app, pinning the cafe as the exit location. One car sat idling a few blocks away, ready on standby. She flagged the driver, paid in advance. Then she called over 2 ushers she trusted, young men from her community choir, not beholden to Stephen's side of the family. In low voices, she instructed them. When Amina speaks, you move the elders to the front pews. Keep them safe. No pushing, no confusion. They nodded, wide-eyed but firm. Tasha's last call was to venue security. She told them politely but firmly to remain alert near the nave doors. We may have a disruption, she said. Please ensure the bride is not blocked or touched. If anyone grows aggressive, step in. The security captain, a tall woman with a calm demeanor, met Amina's gaze. You'll be protected, she promised. Every piece was sliding into place. Not a revenge plot whispered in corners, but a carefully woven fabric of community choreography. Each ally held a thread. Each thread made the net stronger. In the silence that followed, Amina looked out the window again. She could see the hotel across the street, the lights of the ballroom glowing like a beacon. She imagined Mason at the podium, shaking hands, smiling for cameras. Soon his eyes might turn to her, to them. Her reflection in the glass startled her, the satin gown, the dark eyes rimmed in red, the steady line of her jaw. She hardly recognized herself, and yet she knew this was the truest version of her she had ever seen. Are you ready? Tasha asked quietly. Amina nodded once. I'm ready. For years she had dreamed of walking down the aisle into the arms of love. Tonight she would walk into something else entirely, the unmasking of a lie, the restoration of her dignity, the moment her voice carried above the hollow music of pretense. And across the street, the man who had been her groom's hero might just bear witness. The stage was chosen. The audience had been invited. The play was about to begin. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they swung open. No music cued her entrance. No organ swell, no string quartet striking chords of romance. Only silence, thick, electric, charged with questions that no one dared ask aloud. Every conversation stopped. Fans folded mid-flutter. Children hushed as though sensing the gravity of something unnameable. Amina stepped through her satin gown, trailing behind her like a river of white flame. She did not glance at the decorations, bouquets of roses trembling in crystal vases, candles flickering against stained glass. None of that mattered now. Every step she took down the center aisle was deliberate, echoing against the stone floor, the sound resonating louder than any organ hymn could. Stephen's head snapped up from where he stood at the altar. Relief flooded his face, first relief that the bride had finally appeared, that the ceremony might continue. He smoothed his tuxedo lapel and forced the smile he had practiced for photographs. But under the chandelier's glow it looked stretched, desperate. He stepped forward, opening his arms. You okay? His voice was light, feigned concern dripping through. Everyone was worried. Amina stopped halfway down the aisle. She did not quicken her pace to reach him. Instead, she raised her chin, her eyes locked on his with a calmness so sharp it cut. We'll speak here, she said. Her voice carried clearly, though she hadn't raised it. The acoustics of the church seemed to favor her, amplifying her words with the resonance of stone. A ripple went through the pews. Guests exchanged bewildered glances, whispers sprouting like wild grass. Pastor James, standing uncertain at the altar, looked between them. Perhaps we should, Pastor, Amina interrupted gently but firmly. May I have the microphone, please? He hesitated, caught between tradition and truth. Then he nodded, his solemn face heavy with understanding. Slowly, reverently, he lifted the microphone from its stand and extended it to her. The weight of it settled in her hands. She had always imagined holding flowers, vows, a husband's hands on this day. Not this cold metal shaft, but it was fitting. Her weapon now was her voice. She turned to the crowd, not with tears, not with rage, but with measured control. Her eyes swept the room, pausing on her parents seated together, their hands knotted tight. Her father's gaze was steady, her mother's glistening with tears already. She felt their strength run through her veins. When she spoke again, her words carved the silence with precision. I will not sign papers with a man who speaks about my family as leverage. The words landed like a stone dropped in a still pond. The ripples were immediate gasps, startled murmurs, the shifting of bodies in pews. Every guest who had come expecting vows of love now sat in stunned disbelief. Stephen's smile faltered. He laughed, but it rang hollow. What, Amina? Sweetheart, you're stressed. This is the nerves talking. Her grip on the microphone tightened. No. This is clarity. Before he could respond, a figure stepped from the side aisle. Tasha, her lavender dress rumpled, her eyes ablaze with purpose. In her hand was her phone. She tapped the screen, held it to the microphone. A voice filled the sanctuary. Stephen's voice. She knows better than to embarrass her people. The words rang disembodied, yet undeniable. Murmurs turned into low exclamations. Heads snapped toward Stephen. Some guests covered their mouths. Amina's aunt gasped audibly, clutching her chest. Stephen's face blanched. He stepped forward, hands outstretched in protest. It was a joke, Stress. You know how it is before weddings, people say dumb things. But no one laughed. No one looked convinced. His voice, stripped of charm, had revealed its own contempt. Amina stood unflinching, the microphone still in her hand. She didn't need to shout. The calm steadiness in her posture made his flailing look frantic, juvenile. This is not nerves, she said, her voice cutting through his excuses. This is who you are. You speak of boundaries of control as if marriage is a contract to cage me. You speak of my family as if they are burdens to manage, not blessings to embrace. Gasps echoed again. A guest in the third row shook his head in disbelief. An elderly woman near the back muttered a prayer under her breath. Stephen tugged at his collar, sweat blooming along his hairline. You're twisting my words. Everyone here knows I love you. Don't let them think otherwise. But the illusion had cracked. The more he pleaded, the more hollow his words became. And then the doors at the back of the church opened. No one had expected another entrance. Heads swiveled. Whispers hissed. The late afternoon light spilled in, framing the silhouette of a tall man in a tailored suit. His presence alone quieted the room. Marcus Mason, Stephen's idol. His hero. The very man he had boasted about impressing with this marriage. He didn't stride in with pomp. He entered quietly, hands folded, eyes scanning the scene with calm gravity. The applause from the luncheon still echoed faintly across the street, but here the only sound was the hush of a congregation watching power shift in real time. Amina turned her head just enough to see him, but she did not falter. Her focus remained on Stephen, her voice steady. I will not marry a man who trades love for leverage. The line cut like a blade. It wasn't an insult. It was a boundary. And boundaries once drawn in public became harder to erase. Marcus Mason walked slowly down the aisle, each step a punctuation mark in the silence. He stopped near the back pews, his folded hands resting before him, choosing to stand as an observer rather than a judge. Yet his presence carried judgment enough. Stephen's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The sight of his CEO in the church stripped the last of his bravado. His hand twitched at his side, desperate to maintain control, but control was gone. The guests leaned forward in their seats, caught between horror and awe. They had come for a wedding. Instead, they were witnessing a reckoning, and Amina, holding the microphone steady, stood at the center, not as a victim but as the one delivering the opening salvo of truth. The hush that followed Amina's words was so heavy it felt alive. The crowd was still reeling from her calm boundary, from the audio clip that revealed Stephen's disdain. And then, like a stone dropped into still water, Marcus Mason's voice entered the sanctuary. I was told we have a values issue. The CEO's baritone carried without strain, resonant and measured. Every head turned toward the back doors where he stood. He didn't stride in like a rescuer. He walked with the steadiness of a man who had been listening far longer than anyone realized. His presence shifted the air. Guests stiffened, whispers crackled down pews. Even Pastor James's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the edge of the pulpit. Stephen froze, his practiced charm collapsing in an instant. Marcus's gaze fixed on him. Mr. Hale, he said evenly, did you call this marriage great optics for our Q3 deck? The words detonated inside the church. A collective gasp erupted, a chorus of disbelief and outrage. Somewhere near the middle rows, an usher jolted so violently that the entire stack of programs slipped from his arms and scattered like fallen leaves across the floor. Stephen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. His tongue darted nervously against his lips. Sir. Of course not. That's not. He sputtered, the confident cadence gone, replaced by the stammer of a man caught without a script. Tasha stepped forward, her lavender dress catching the candlelight, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and triumph. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every soul in the sanctuary leaned toward her as she lifted her phone once more. "Then explain this," she said. On the microphone came the sound of scrolling clicks, and then the faint ding of an attachment opening. She held the screen aloft, so the front pews could see the message header. The vendor's email lit in stark black and white letters. Cut Yoruba drum interlude. Replace with contemporary playlist. Must keep elegant. Gasps swept the crowd again. Some shifted in their seats horrified. Others craned to glimpse the damning CC line, Stephen's assistant and Stephen himself. Amina's aunt, who had prepared for months to play her drum, pressed both hands to her mouth. Her shoulders shook not only with grief but with rage, the erasure of her culture laid bare before everyone. Stephen stumbled forward, palms raised as if to physically push the evidence away. "That's out of context." It was a suggestion, not. But his words faltered, for there was more. Tasha's finger slid across the screen again. She tapped another file. This time the display glowed with a screenshot blurred slightly at the edges but sharp in its damning center. A Slack capture. The name at the top was redacted, but the timestamp glowed clear, and the highlighted phrase pierced through the hush like a knife. "Great optics for the Q3 philanthropy deck." Exactly what Mason likes to see. The sanctuary erupted. Murmurs exploded into audible disbelief. "Optics," someone hissed. "Philanthropy deck." Another voice cursed under their breath. The base of the church's sound system seemed to tremble as if it too registered the weight of the revelation. It was no longer about careless remarks or cultural contempt whispered in private. This was the motive spelled out, corporate and cold. Amina had never been a partner in Stephen's eyes. She had been a presentation slide. A low sound escaped Diane, Stephen's mother. Not a gasp, not denial, something closer to a groan of recognition. She covered her face with her hand, but not fast enough to hide the truth in her expression. This wasn't shock at scandal. This was horror at her own complicity, at years of silence, at the subtle nods and tight smiles she had given whenever Stephen dismissed Amina's family. She looked down at her lap as though seeing for the first time the wreckage her silence had enabled. The heartbeat of the moment shifted. Pastor James lowered his head, lips moving in silent prayer. Ushers stood frozen, clutching their posts. In the back pews, Marcus Mason exhaled slowly, his voice steady when he spoke again. "We don't market human beings." The statement landed like scripture. Not shouted, not dramatic, but final. The authority in his tone made it clear Stephen had not merely failed as a fiancé. He had violated something deeper, something sacred even in corporate language: values, dignity, humanity. Stephen's face contorted. Panic and anger warred in his eyes. He lunged forward, reaching for Amina's hand, trying to close the distance between them, to drag her back into the script he thought he still controlled. "Amina, please, you know I love you. Don't let this ruin everything." But she stepped back. Just one step, but it was enough. Enough to make his grasp fall short. Enough to show the entire room that she had withdrawn her consent, her trust, her place beside him. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence was louder than any accusation. The receipts had spoken for her. Stephen froze in the empty air between them, his hands suspended, and then slowly dropping to his side. His suit, so carefully pressed, now clung damply to his shoulders. His tie sagged. The mask was gone. Amina stood tall, microphone still steady, her expression calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply existed in her own dignity, no longer bound by his ambitions. The church itself seemed to hold its breath. Guests leaned forward, eyes wide, hearts thudding in collective disbelief. The betrayal was no longer whispers. It was no longer her word against his. It was evidence: emails, Slack, timestamps, the cold corporate language of exploitation. And for the first time since the ceremony began, Amina felt the tremor in her chest still. Not because the pain had lessened, but because the truth had finally been dragged into the light. No shadows remained. The evidence had been read aloud in the vaulted chamber of the church, and the light had poured onto Stephen Hale in a way no groom could escape. The crowd was hushed, unsettled, some holding their breath, some clutching the pews as if afraid of what might come next. For a heartbeat, it seemed the room would fracture into chaos, shouting accusations, anger, But then something shifted. The silence itself began to swell with another kind of energy conscience. At the far side of the sanctuary, the best man shifted uncomfortably. His face had been pale since Tasha played the audio. He had laughed earlier out in that back room when Stephen joked about Amina's family when cruelty sounded like camaraderie. But now, standing beside Stephen's empty bravado, he caught sight of his wife. She was in the pews cradling their toddler. The child's skin bore the blend of two heritages, the curl of hair that spoke of more than one lineage. The best man's throat tightened. His laughter from earlier now echoed back at him like poison. He thought of his child growing up in a world where people like Stephen sneered behind closed doors. He thought of the day when someone might call his son less, not for who he was, but for who his parents were. He swallowed, then stepped forward. His voice cracked at first, but grew steadier with each word. "Put my name on a statement," he said. His eyes fixed on Stephen. He said it. I heard it, and I laughed. But I won't hide behind silence now. He said it. A ripple went through the pews. Gasps, yes, but also nods. A few claps, even soft but firm. It wasn't applause for drama. It was affirmation for truth. Stephen's head whipped toward his friend, betrayal flashing across his face. "You're twisting this." But the best man did not flinch. He looked toward Amina. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his voice carrying in the microphone's absence. "For laughing, for not stopping him, for being complicit." The church seemed to inhale all at once. And then from the back another voice rose. A younger man in a plain suit, almost blending into the crowd until now. His hands trembled but his chin lifted. "My name is Jay," he said, eyes flicking nervously toward Marcus Mason, who stood silently observing. "I was the one who sent the Slack capture. I can authenticate it. If legal allows, I can show the logs, timestamps, origin, everything." This wasn't hearsay. It was real. The sanctuary shifted again. Where there had been whispers of doubt, now there was the solidity of multiple witnesses. The story was no longer one woman's claim. It was layered testimony, confession, verification. Stephen's composure snapped. "This is insane. You're all conspiring. This is my wedding." His voice rose frantic and jagged, echoing too harshly against the stone walls. Security moved closer, their steps quiet but deliberate. Their presence was enough to make his movements stall. Pastor James, his voice low but commanding, raised a hand. "This house will hold order," he intoned. "Truth has been spoken. Let no one turn it into riot." The authority in his tones settled the restless murmurs. The guests straightened, realizing they were not a mob, they were witnesses, and witnesses bore responsibility. Amina, standing at the center of it all, felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. But she also felt something else, their support, subtle but real, flowing toward her like unseen currents. She turned toward the small table at the altar, where the marriage license rested. The papers that had been prepared with ceremony, waiting for signatures that would never come. She walked slowly, each step steady, her gown whispering across the stone. She paused, looking down at the document. For a moment her reflection shimmered faintly on the glossy surface of the table, her face pale, her eyes resolute. She placed one hand on the papers, inhaled deeply. Then, with the microphone still in her other hand, she drew in a breath that reached the depths of her chest. Her voice was clear, calm, ceremonial. "I choose a life with no PR department." The words struck the air like bells. Some guests tilted their heads, puzzled at first. But then they understood. She was declaring that her life would not be a campaign, a photo op, a deck for corporate philanthropy. It would be hers, unbranded, unbought, unmarketed. With deliberate slowness she lifted the license. The silence was absolute now, as though the building itself leaned forward to listen. Her fingers gripped the edge of the paper. And then came the sound. The tear. Amplified by the microphone, it ripped through the sanctuary, loud and unmistakable. Not the furious tearing of rage, but the solemn rending of something false. The sound of refusal, final and irrevocable. Gasps surged, then quieted as quickly as they came. The halves of the license fluttered from her hands, gliding downward until they landed on the stone floor. A shaft of sunlight angled through the stained glass window at that moment, catching the torn papers as they fell, painting them gold for an instant before they touched the ground. At that same instant, the toddler in the best man's wife's arms cooed softly, a sound so innocent, so unplanned, that it pierced through the tension like grace. A few guests wept openly then, not only for the betrayal laid bare but for the fragile hope symbolized by that small, unknowing voice. Stephen staggered, his face ashen, his lips trembling with words that would not form. He reached out one last time toward Amina, but the gesture collapsed in midair. She did not flinch, did not recoil. She simply stood apart, sovereign whole. The torn halves lay at her feet, sunlight pooling around them. The symbolism needed no explanation. The chorus had changed key. What began as whispers of doubt had become voices of conscience. Allies had stepped forward. Evidence had been confirmed. And now the woman at the heart of it all had marked the end, not with vengeance but with a ceremony of her own choosing. The sanctuary still quivered with the echoes of torn paper when Amina turned away from the altar. Her gown brushed the stone floor, the halves of the marriage license lying in sunlight behind her like discarded skin. She had walked through fire and emerged intact. Now she needed air. The church doors swung wide, and the outside world rushed in cool, sharp cleansing. It was like plunging into water after being held too long in suffocating heat. The late evening air wrapped around her shoulders, loosening the knots in her chest. But she was not alone. Her family moved with her, surrounding her without words, their bodies forming a quiet shield against curious eyes and potential malice. Cousins closed ranks. An uncle took up position at her side, broad-shouldered, watchful. Her mother's hand pressed warm into her back, guiding her forward, while her father kept pace at her other side, steady as a wall. The crowd outside, some guests who had drifted out, neighbors who had heard rumors, whispered and pointed. But no one approached. Amina's family had created a circle, a boundary of love and muscle that could not be breached. And then, like a blessing from a different world, Miss Louise appeared. The cafe owner, the woman who had offered sanctuary earlier in the day, walked up the church steps with slow dignity, a thermos tucked beneath her arm. She said nothing at first, just pressed the warm container into Amina's hands. "Tea," she murmured. "Chamomile with honey. Calm the shaking before it starts again." Steam drifted into the cool night, curling upward, catching the glow of the streetlight. Amina lifted the lid and breathed in the sweetness, her throat easing just from the scent. Gratitude welled up, hot and overwhelming. The circle of family guided her toward a waiting car. Inside, Tasha tapped at her phone, still in strategist mode, her voice calm, though her eyes showed the storm still raging within. "We need to cover the legal side," she said. "I'm calling cousin Reggie. He knows contract law." Within minutes, Amina was on speakerphone with a lawyerly voice that carried both precision and kinship. "First, don't panic about deposits," Reggie said firmly. "You have grounds for cancellation without penalty. Fraudulent intent, reputational harm. The venue will fold rather than risk headlines." Marisol, who had followed them outside, added softly, "I'll waive my own planner's fee. I will not profit from his deceit. Consider it my offering." The band's leader, who had been standing nearby with his instruments packed, spoke up as well. "No charge for tonight. Call it a dignity discount." A ripple of laughter moved through the circle, small, tired but real. Amina held the thermos closer, the tea warming her hands, and let herself lean against the car seat as the details blurred into the hum of voices working in concert for her. They drove across town, the headlights sweeping past storefronts, laundromats, and familiar blocks that looked suddenly softer in the night. When they pulled up to Aunt Renee's house, a modest brick row home with flowers spilling out of mismatched pots by the stoop, Amina felt her throat constrict. Inside, the living room was transformed into a landing pad for her heart. Blankets draped over the couch pillows, stacked high, a tray of cornbread on the coffee table, as though someone had known she'd come hungry, even if she didn't want to eat. Aunt Renee herself bustled forward, arms strong and wide, pulling Amina into an embrace that smelled of coconut oil and home. "Sit, baby," she said, guiding her to the couch. "You've been standing tall all day. Let somebody else hold you now." A cousin fetched a bowl of warm water and a bottle of oil. Aunt Renee massaged Amina's scalp with slow, practiced motions, smoothing coconut oil through her hair the way women in the family had done for generations when words weren't enough. Amina closed her eyes, the tension draining from her shoulders, tears slipping free at last. Around her voices murmured, not in gossip, not in speculation, but in care. Someone tucked a blanket around her knees. Someone else rubbed her back. A child padded in from the kitchen and offered her a cookie with solemn eyes. She took it, broke it in half, and fed the child a piece before nibbling the rest. Time slowed, softened. The adrenaline ebbed. What remained was exhaustion, but also safety. Later, when the house quieted, and most of the family settled into chairs or found spots on the floor, Amina stepped out onto the porch. The night was alive with sound. The creak of the old porch swing swaying in the breeze. The high chorus of insects in the yard. The distant wail of a city siren cutting across blocks. Her father followed her out, moving with the heaviness of a man who carried not only his own day but the weight of hers. He didn't speak immediately. They stood side by side, watching the glow of the streetlight halo the steam from her half-finished tea. Finally, his voice broke the quiet. "My grandmother," he said slowly, "once walked away from a sharecropping contract. They cheated her, promised her a fair cut, then took more than their share. She looked them in the eye, told them she wouldn't work land that stole from her children, packed what little she had and left." Amina listened, her heart aching at the story. He turned to her, his face lit by the porch light, lined with years but strong. "Our line has walked away from bad deals before. Tonight, you joined them. You didn't just save yourself, daughter. You stood in a tradition." Tears blurred her vision. She pressed the thermos to her lips, sipping the last of the tea. The honey coated her throat, easing the rawness left from speaking truth into a microphone that had carried it across stone walls and into 100 ears. The porch swing creaked again, rocking gently in the night. She sat down, her father lowering himself beside her. They didn't speak more. They didn't need to. The night insects sang. The siren faded into the distance. And in the glow of the streetlight, steam still curled from her cup, a small, ordinary miracle of comfort. For the first time that day, Amina let herself lean back, close her eyes, and simply be held by the night. For the first time in many hours, Amina had slept. Not deeply, not without waking from dreams that spun back to the church doors and the sound of tearing paper, but enough to feel her body was no longer trembling when she rose. Aunt Renee's house smelled of fried plantains and coffee. The sunlight through the curtains was gentle. The house hummed with the steady sounds of family. The storm had passed. Now came the week after. News traveled fast. By Monday morning, Hale and Harrington's Human Resources Department had already heard pieces of what happened. At first they thought it was gossip, rumors of a wedding gone wrong, a bride walking away. But then an usher's cousin posted online about the audio clip played in the sanctuary. Vendors whispered to one another about the email canceling the Yoruba drums, and someone somewhere had passed the Slack screenshot higher up the chain. Marcus Mason, who had left the church without fanfare, did not ignore it. On Tuesday, an internal memo landed in inboxes company-wide. Subject: our commitment to values. Body: recent events have underscored the need to reaffirm who we are. We do not exploit diversity for optics. We do not reduce human beings to campaigns. Effective immediately, all management staff will undergo revised ethics training with emphasis on accountability and equity. Pending investigation, Mr. Stephen Hale's promotion is suspended. The words were measured, but their impact was thunder. Employees forwarded the memo to each other, whispering about the scandal. Some defended Stephen, saying he'd been under stress. Others shook their heads, saying they had heard him joke before. But the company line was clear: exploitation would not be tolerated. Stephen tried to spin the story. He posted carefully crafted messages on social media, citing personal misunderstandings, painting himself as the victim of nerves and miscommunication. He even hired a publicist who encouraged him to smile in photographs at a charity 5 Kelvins the following weekend. It did not work. The community itself carried the truth, and they carried it with precision. Guests who had been present spoke quietly but firmly. The audio clip circulated among them, passed in group chats, replayed in living rooms. Vendors confirmed the authenticity of the email. And churchgoers retold the moment when Amina's voice rang steady. "I will not sign papers with a man who speaks about my family as leverage." Amina never posted. She didn't need to. The story was not hers to spread, but theirs to confirm. And they did. Not with malice, not with frenzy, but with a kind of calm, collective responsibility. On Wednesday, an email from Miss Marisol arrived in Amina's inbox. Subject: We choose people over paper body, dear Amina. All deposits are refunded, no penalty fees. This is the least we can do. Please know that your dignity is worth far more than any contract. With respect, Marisol. Amina sat at her desk at home reading those words, her throat thick. She clicked save and let the subject line glow on her screen a little longer. By Thursday, she returned to her own job at the community center, where she had worked quietly for 3 years. Walking through the doors that morning, she felt every eye notice her. Some colleagues smiled, some nodded, some simply looked down out of respect. No one asked intrusive questions. On her desk, she found a sticky note. The handwriting was looping bold. It came from Miss Jordan, a senior staff member, a woman who had been through decades of battles Amina could only imagine. The note said, "Head up. Crown on." It was not advice. It was recognition. Amina pressed the note into her planner where it would stay. By Friday, opportunity had come knocking, not in the way Stephen once dreamed, with corporate promotions and polished optics, but in the form of genuine community building. A grant notice arrived in her inbox. Community Arts and Healing Initiative, seeking proposals for projects led by women of color. The deadline was weeks away, but the timing felt almost divine. She met with Miss Louise at the caf that afternoon. The mural of Harriet Tubman on the brick wall seemed to gleam brighter in the late light. Miss Louise leaned across the counter, her voice soft but firm. "You want a wall, you take mine. Paint your story. Paint our story. Let the kids see it when they walk to school." The offer stunned Amina. She held Louise's hand, the warmth of it grounding her, the tears threatening again, but this time from gratitude. Later that evening, she opened her mailbox and found a plain envelope slipped beneath her door. No return address. Inside was a check, not large but enough, attached to a note in clean, careful handwriting. For the work, not the optics. Staff at the Mason Foundation. It was not signed by Marcus. It had come through staff channels, processed quietly, no spotlight. Exactly what she needed: support without strings. A week had passed. The scandal had not destroyed her. The gossip had not drowned her. Instead, her community had carried her, shielded her, and now lifted her into something new. On Saturday morning, she stood before a blank stretch of cafe wall with a box of paints at her feet. She picked up a marker first, the squeak of its tip scratching against the brick as she sketched the first lines. Children gathered, watching with wide eyes. Adults stood back, nodding silently. Each line was a seed of renewal, each stroke of color a declaration. She was not optics. She was not leverage. She was not a slide in a presentation deck. She was a creator, a daughter, a woman who had chosen truth over illusion. The systems around her had not collapsed. They had shifted imperfectly but tangibly toward accountability. It was not vengeance. It was not prison. It was recognition and correction. It was, for once, a small measure of justice, and as she painted beneath the warm light of a community cafe, the city itself seemed to hum with her. The hum of the city had followed her into Saturday night, and by the following weekend that hum had grown into something brighter. Laughter brushes on brick, the rhythm of a new chapter beginning. It was opening day of Crown and Compass, Amina's community art program. The cafe courtyard had been transformed into a patchwork of color and sound. Children knelt on tarps with plastic cups of paint, their fingers messy, their giggles contagious. Elders sat in folding chairs telling stories of migration, of bus rides north during the Great Migration, of mothers who worked night shifts and fathers who carried toolboxes into factories. Every story wound itself into the mural taking shape on the cafe wall, arcs of bright color, depicting black joy lines, suggesting migration paths that curved into a compass, rose portraits of everyday heroes, a grandmother at a stove, a boy reading under a streetlight, a nurse tying her shoes at dawn. Amina moved among them with her sleeves rolled up, paint streaking her arms, a brush still damp in her hand. She was not directing like a boss. She was guiding like a gardener, letting others plant their own colors into the wall. At one point, she noticed a man sitting quietly in the back corner of the cafe, hands folded over a cup of coffee. He wasn't in a suit this time, just a plain jacket, his presence unannounced. Marcus Mason. He didn't approach her. He didn't ask for photographs. He simply bought coffee for a table of teenagers, sketching designs on napkins. When he rose to leave, he slipped a card onto the counter. On the back in his handwriting was a single line, "No campaigns, just support." By the time Amina noticed, he was gone. She tucked the card into her sketchbook, feeling neither beholden nor suspicious. For once, a gesture was what it appeared to be: quiet, small, human. The day pressed on. Tasha wandered over with a grin, her camera slung at her side. "You know," she teased, "this story isn't done. You've already got letters coming in. Someone wrote that they walked away from a toxic job after watching you stand up in that church. Said they chose themselves. That's your next episode right there." Amina laughed, wiping a streak of turquoise paint across her cheek. The thought of strangers finding courage in her story was both humbling and a little surreal, but she tucked it away, another thread for later. As the sun dropped lower, she set up a small tripod in the corner. It was time to record what she had promised. No script, no edits, just one clean take. The cafe quieted slightly as she lifted her phone, pressed record, and began to speak into the mic. Her voice was even, but her eyes carried the weight of what she had lived. "Love without respect," she said, "is brand strategy. I choose respect." She let the words hang for a beat, then continued. "If you've ever walked away from a bad deal, marriage, job contract, anything, comment below. I chose myself. Let it be a reminder that you're not alone. And if this gave you courage, subscribe so it can reach someone who needs it tonight." She drew a breath, her expression softening. "For the next episode, I want your input. Do you want part 2 at the office hearing, or part 2 about the mural kid who changed my life? Leave it in the comments. I'll listen." She stopped recording, saved the video, and placed the phone down. Around her, children painted in the fading light, elders hummed old songs, and the wall filled steadily with color. Before closing the cafe door for the evening, Amina hung a small wooden sign she had painted herself. The words, scrawled in careful strokes, read, "No PR departments allowed, only people." She stepped back, looked at it, and smiled. Not triumphant over Stephen, not bitter at his downfall. Simply rooted in herself, in the life she was choosing to build. Not for optics, not for leverage, but for truth. The door chime jingled softly as she walked back inside. She exhaled deep and unhurried. Behind her, the mural's compass rose gleamed in the last of the sun's light, its points reaching outward, guiding anyone who looked upon it toward something larger than survival. Toward dignity, toward joy. And as the laughter of children echoed across the courtyard, the screen faded to black. If this story touched you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit the like button so more people can find it. Leave a comment and tell us what part spoke to you most, or simply write, "I chose myself." If you've ever walked away from something that didn't honor your worth. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we share new stories of dignity, resilience, and real love. Your support helps this message reach the person who needs it tonight.